Hi, I'm Bruce Coudray from Benchmark Business Sales. Whether you're buying or selling a business, there's a lot of steps involved in the whole process from start to finish. And over the years, we've put together what we call a sales process timeline, which is kind of like a guide to all the steps that need to be checked off during the sale. Most of these steps relate to the seller, and it's of interest to the seller to understand and think about these things, but it's also really important for buyers who are looking to acquire a business to think about these things as well. The first step that normally happens in the sales process is the vendor, that business owners, put together what we call a disclosure document. A disclosure document is used to gather all the data, all the information about the business, and it's sort of the foundation upon which the whole sale process is based. So once we've got that disclosure document back and it's fully completed, then we're able to do an appraisal, and that's the second step. So at Benchmark, we give a written appraisal on the business, which also includes a bit of a report on how we're going to market and sell it and other things, but the primary part of that is to ascertain what it's going to sell for. And to be able to talk about what we think it's going to sell for, and to use proven methodologies to select a price, a market value that we think the business is going to sell for. So the second step is the appraisal. Then the next thing that we go to is we produce a marketing plan. That enables us to think about who's going to buy the business, how to attract the right buyers in a sea of about 41,000 businesses for sale across Australia, and all the people that are looking to buy. Looking at those 41,000 businesses, we need to decide how we're going to get your business in front of the right people. So that's part of the marketing plan. The next thing is that the seller will pay the marketing fee. We'll agree on the process, and that will have a fee. And then the fifth step is that the broker will complete an information memorandum request internally in our office, and that'll enable the broker to produce the information memorandum, which sort of comes from the appraisal document anyway, but it's the information that we're going to give to buyers or interested parties under confidentiality agreement to enable them to decide if they want to go further with the business or if it's not for them. Sometimes that'll be a very small document, sometimes it'll be quite prolific. The next step is that we'll get a draft contract produced, and this is really important. This is probably one of the most important steps in preparation. A lot of companies believe, or people believe, that you don't need a contract ready until you get a buyer, but that's absolutely wrong. That's too late. We need to identify the issues right at the start, and we use a thing called a sale planner, which we'll talk about in another video, to do that. And the sale plan enables us to produce a contract knowing what's going to be an asset sale or a share sale, how you're going to deal with entitlements, restriction of trade, tuition, assistance, all the nuances, stock, work in progress, all the things that we need to think about when transacting the sale. So we get a draft contract ready, just like when you're selling a house at auction, we have that contract ready. So when the buyer comes along, we're ready to go ahead, and there's no delays in the process. Very important thing. So then if we've got all that done, usually the seller will sign the authority and give us the authority to go ahead. So we'll get that done. Then we'll prepare the presentation and the financials, and we'll have everything ready. Sometimes we'll need to load those into an online data room or some other provision, Dropbox or whatever it is, so that the buyers can use that and we can monitor what's happening with the sale. In part of the preparation, one of the next steps that we need to do is get a certificate of clearance. So if the business is over a certain value threshold, we need to get that in place as well. Then we'll go ahead and implement the marketing plan. That's the next step. Then after that, get confidentiality in place. So inquiries will start coming through, and when we get those inquiries, we make sure that the person or the company that's inquiring has completed a confidentiality deed. We'll get that on file. We'll probably check with the business owners to say, look, we've got this inquiry, you're happy for us to go ahead and provide them information. That's all done. We've got everything ready, draft contract, got a buyer interested, they want to go ahead. We'll either have an inspection, sometimes it's called an inspection, or a meeting, or we'll let them come and have a look at the business, or they'll cruise by, depending on what we're selling and how we're selling it. So usually after that, we'll have a meeting, and at that meeting, either at that meeting or after that meeting, we'll negotiate the terms of sale and possibly a price. And if that's agreed, we'll get a letter of offer, heads of agreement, term sheet, some sort of document, binding or non-binding, in place that enables the parties to know that's the deal, that's the starting point. Now we're going to work on the nuances and the details. But we'll use that draft contract as preparation, and we'll use that as a starting point. So the next thing is, at that meeting or just after that meeting, once we've got that agreement in principle in place, we'll demonstrate the timeline. We'll sit down with people and we'll demonstrate the timeline of what's happening, who's going to do what, where, when, who's responsible for each part of the process along the way, from that date right through to completion. And there's a lot of steps along the way. Then we'll get the contracts executed and signed off. At that point, quite often we'll get a deposit paid. And depending on which state it's in, sometimes in some states we'll do the due diligence and those other things, get the finance approval before the contract's entered into, and in some other states it'll be after the contract. So the example I'm running through here today is in states like Queensland, Western Australia, South Australia. we'll get a contract entered into, and then we'll do the due diligence and so on. We'll put the deposit into a trust account. We'll get a trust account receipt to the purchaser, and that money stays in the trust account and can be either interest bearing or non-interest bearing. The next thing that happens is sometimes the vendor has an obligation to check if there's a first right of refusal needs to be offered, and if that's the case, we'll get that out of the way as well. So after the first right of refusal has been sorted out and dispensed with if necessary, we'll send the contracts to all the parties, which includes the landlord if necessary, or the landlord's lawyer, so we can make sure that if there's a lease assignment involved, that's not going to delay the settlement, depending on the type of business we're selling. Now at this point, it's usually a great idea to have a face-to-face meeting between the parties, the buyers, the company representatives of the buyer and the seller, to get together and just flesh out what we've done to date, where we've been and what we're going to do next. The next thing that we do is if there's a need to, if it's a franchise, we'll get any franchise application forms. If there's any supply agreements to be done, we'll get that out of the way. And at this point, usually within 7 days of the contract date, the seller has an obligation to pass over to the buyer any staff details, because the buyer will need to decide if they're going to keep those staff or make those staff redundant. So we go through that. So those staff details are supplied after about 7 days normally. Then if we need to, sometimes there's disclosure documents that need to be prepared and signed for either a franchise or a lease assignment or a new lease. So there can be statutory requirements within each state. So we'll get it all out of the way. Sometimes we need to have interviews with franchisors or landlords to get that done. Sometimes in some businesses there's supply agreements, this is in service stations or some supermarkets or other retailers, so we make sure that any supply agreements are sorted out. If there's property involved, we sometimes need to get an environmental site assessment done, testing, council approvals, that sort of thing. So that's the next step that should take place. Now we're getting to the point where the purchaser up to this stage has been dependent on getting finance approval. So by this point, we should have done everything that we can have got done. Due diligence will be going on. We'll get all that done and hopefully the finance will be approved or not. If that's approved, we keep moving forward. We'll book a stock taker, because you need to, if there's stock involved, get the stock taker organised. Sometimes the purchaser will need to provide a bill of sale to the landlord or a supplier, so make sure that's done. At this point, we start talking about training and getting the training organised for the seller or the seller's employees to transfer ownership. Then we'll confirm at this point that the landlord's approved the purchaser, and that if any lease assignment is going to need to be done, that we can get that done. And that could also apply to suppliers or franchisor. At this point, we're probably about ready for the due diligence to be completed, and if that's complete, ticked off, and everything else is done, finance is approved, we know the lease assignment, if necessary, is going to occur, or lease assignments is going to be no problem. We've sort of ticked most boxes. We're at the point, at this stage, where you could call it unconditional. So at that point, it's probable that if the purchase doesn't go ahead, they could default and forfeit the deposit. So that's why we call it unconditional. So at that point, we'll have another meeting, and at this point, the buyer's committed, the seller's committed, everyone's committed. We're moving forward, and it's really good to have that meeting and know that we're near the finish line, and we all address the issues that we need to get sorted out at that meeting to enable settlement to occur. We talk about the FPOS, the phone, the power, the internet, all those things changing over, cash floats, ATM machines, whatever's involved there. Get all that sorted out. We agree on the stock take procedure, when we're going to do it, how much time we're going to spend on it, whether we're going to get an independent stock taker to do it, or we're going to do it ourselves. At this point, it's also the right time to advise the staff and the suppliers and the landlord or whoever else is involved that the business has been sold, and so that sort of veil of secrecy can be lifted and we can tell the world that it's been sold. We'll commence tuition, so the buyer will start learning how to run the business and doing that transfer of operations. Might be the buyer, might be the buyer's general manager or staff. We'll make sure that the PPSR is cleared, so sometimes, or is going to be able to be cleared. So sometimes when we're transferring ownership of assets, they'll have personal property security registered on those assets. So make sure that we know that at settlement that's got to be taken off. We'll make sure the franchisor training's been done. We'll make sure the landlord's lease agreement to the assignment of the lease is in place, or a new lease. We clear any need for right of entry with the landlords at that point. Sometimes in some hospitality businesses there'll be a lease over assets in the kitchen with companies like Silver Chef, so make sure that any finances there are cleared. We remind the buyers to order uniforms or clothes or badges or that sort of thing, organise the power phone, FPOS phones. We check the solicitors are satisfied with conditions and we're ready to settle. We get licenses, permits, patents, certificates and so on in place to be transferred. Any rental arrears, we make sure that there's no rental arrears there. The day before settlement, we'll walk around, we'll make sure that all your inventory is there, all the assets are there, they're all working, and we'll make sure that any leased equipment is paid out if it's going to be sold unencumbered. So we have the settlement date, we do a stock take normally on that date, then we'll adjust for any prepaid accounts or deposits. So some businesses, the owners of the business will take a deposit, and the new owner of the business is going to undertake that work, so that deposit needs to be transferred to the purchaser. Sometimes we need to make many other adjustments from tax or entitlements, employee entitlements, long service leave, that sort of thing. So all that's done at this stage. We adjust for any subleases if that's applicable. Any motor vehicles that are being transferred ownership, we'll make sure that there's safety certificates or pink slips, depending on what the state is, on those. Then the seller will hand over to the buyer the keys, security codes, passwords, and all those sorts of things to enable settlement to occur. Then we'll settle. So that's sort of the moment where people start popping champagne corks and celebrating. There's still a few more things to do after that. So after that, we need to make sure that the buyer has got their work cover and insurance and ATO registration in place. We make sure the buyer's paid the seller for any change flowed or any cash in the ATM, that sort of thing. If everything's right, the deposit gets discharged from the trust account at that point. And the last thing that needs to be done is the vendor needs to complete any assistance that they've agreed to provide after settlement to the seller. So they're the normal steps that are involved in the transfer of business ownership, and that's what we use in putting our sales process timeline together. It's a really valuable document, and it's really important that we start right at the beginning with the sales process timeline in mind. Everyone has a role to play in the sale process: the buyer, the seller, the buyer's lawyer, the seller's lawyer, the broker. There's so many parties, and so using that document to keep everyone on track is really important. So if you'd like to learn more about that or think about it more, if you've got any questions, feel free to contact any of our team at any time, and I'm sure one of our brokers or myself or the admin team will be more than happy to help you with any questions you've got. Thanks for listening.